Now from the Vatican, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to this very special World Over from Rome. I'm Raymond Arroyo, privileged to be able to bring you a summation, some highlights of the beatification of Pope John Paul II, now Blessed John Paul II. This week we saw some incredible events, starting with the vigil at the Circus Maximus. More than 200,000 people gathered at the Circus Maximus. It was a soggy night, but boy, they turned out in force. There were testimonies from those who knew John Paul best, his friend Joaquin Navarro-Valls and spokesman, as well as his personal secretary for 40 years, Cardinal Stanislaw Dziwisz. Here's a bit of their testimonies.
And he says that on this day he has the same sentiments, the same emotions that he had just probably a few minutes after the Holy Father's passing. And he remembers how the Holy Father was a man who said yes to God in everything, in every aspect, in every detail of his life. And his expression is, thank you, John Paul II, for that masterpiece which you, with the help of God, wrought of your own life. Joaquin Navarro-Valls, the longtime press office director, is talking now about how the Holy Father realized concretely in his life the profound conviction that he had, that of all the things of which man has needs, and there are many, and his needs are great, he is most in need of the divine mercy. He confessed his sins. He availed himself of the sacrament at least once a week. And he encourages young people and everyone participating in the event to follow his example and to take advantage of the opportunities to receive God's mercy through the sacraments and through specifically the sacrament of reconciliation. The sanctity, the holiness of the life of John Paul II. His life of prayer was profound and intense. The story that Navarro-Valls is now telling, it's a story, the practice of the Holy Father's custom of having intentions, people's intentions written on little pieces of paper. And when he was at prayer, kneeling in his private chapel, he would take them one after the other, sometimes scores and dozens and hundreds of intentions, and would pray for each one. The great attention that John Paul II had, the care, the solicitude for young people, is something that was one of the distinguishing signs of his papacy. But the thing that perhaps escapes people's attention was the strength, the firmness with which the Holy Father often confronted young people, the challenge that he issued, as if he said to young people, dare to live lives of radical Christian discipleship.
Era il significato vero della espressione tanto adoperata, giustamente, del ti voglio bene. Che vuol dire ti voglio bene?
There's this magnificent Italian expression that Navarro-Valls is now discussing. Ti voglio bene translates literally, I wish you well, or perhaps more closely, I wish that which is good for you. I desire your authentic good. And we know in the Christian tradition that this expression is therefore in keeping with the perfection of love, which desires the good and is disposed to sacrifice for the good of the other. This understanding of the structure of love is something that was a profoundly influential lesson on the life of Navarro Valls, as he says here.
Sia lodato Gesù Cristo. Così Santo Padre salutava quando ha cominciato tutti i discorsi, tutti gli incontri con i giovani, con tutti.
Praised be Jesus Christ. These were the words with which the Holy Father used to greet people at the beginning of gatherings like this, and Cardinal Zivit says that he speaks them now on behalf of the Holy Father because he feels his presence. He noted with a wry look that answered the question, the observation with which the presenter began her colloquy here with Cardinal Zivitz. When the Holy Father met him, he had longer hair and more of it. And he said, yes, there was more of it. It was longer and it was also darker. In fact, he was with the Holy Father for many, 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 many years, all throughout his pontificate. He's talking about how when he met him, he was a young professor.
Dopo la lezione, durante l'intervallo, sempre andava in cappella, in chiesa.
And he would go, his lessons were interesting, he says. They were always interesting, but the amazing thing was that he would, in the time between his lessons, he would go to the chapel and spend that time in prayer. Constantly in prayer he was.
Abbiamo avuto impressione che lui incontrato qualcuno.
We always had the impression, even when he was in there by himself, he was always given us the impression that he had met with someone.
Una cosa molto toccante che è rimasta fino ad oggi.
It was very touching. It stayed with me even to now, to this present day. His whole life was lived in communion with God. He's asking now, he said the Cardinal is talking about how the Holy Father did or did not change from the time he was in Krakow to the time he was in Rome. And he says, well, we're wondering who's going to become the next bishop of Krakow, and some people will have to change things about themselves, but if Karol Wojtyła is elected, he is chosen, he won't have to change a thing, and so it was, and it was the same when he became Pope, when he was elected to the See of Peter. He did not have to change a thing about himself. Twice he remembers that the Holy Father was angry.
Contro la mafia.
Contro mafia, ha alzato la voce che
once was against the mafia here in Italy, the organized crime everywhere. And the second time was in the run-up, the Angelus prayer just before the Iraq War, when he cried out with profound emotion, say no to war. War doesn't fix anything. I have known war. I've lived through it.
Perché eravamo convinti che è morto Sazzo.
They're telling the story of how around his deathbed,
Avete ragione. Grazie.
Ci sono
Grazie.
anche altri testimoni di questo momento.
they were sure the Holy Father had passed from this world
A questo momento
and had closed his eyes. Instead of praying the prayer
introduceva
for the dead, they prayed a Te Deum in thanksgiving for the life of witness
Devo finire.
that he had given.
Finisco.
I'm joined on set now by Father Raymond de Sousa, who was with us during the Circus Maximus event and for all the major events of this beatification. Tell me what your thoughts were when you heard those moving testimonies offered by Stanislaw Živic as well as Joaquin Navarro-Valls?
It was extraordinary to see these people who are still active. He's still the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, and how they're continuing his work, but also reflecting on the what Benedict called in his beatification homily, a titan of the Church and of the world. It was very moving to understand that these men had worked very closely with someone now we're venerating as a blessed. This is not some man from a distant part of history, but to hear people who work with him day in and day out, that was moving to me, to realize the immediacy that we're beatifying a man not from a long ago time or far away country.
And there was a real celebratory spirit at that Circus Maximus event. It was very prayerful, because following these testimonies, there was a long recitation of the luminous mysteries, not only from Rome, but from shrines around the world. And we'll show you little glimpses of them. Here's Fatima. And then there was Tanzania in Africa. Of course, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And in Poland.
The Divine Mercy Shrine in Poland.
Yeah, and so it was really, it brought the whole world together, which all of these papal events really do. And, we were delighted to see it and to be a part of that live. Then, of course, the next day, on Sunday, was Divine Mercy Sunday, May Day, St. Joseph's Day, the Worker Day, as well as the feast day of this, or the day when this incredible beatification took place for John Paul II. The significance of the confluence of these times in your mind?
Well, it was an echo of his death, because when he died on a first Saturday, a day dedicated to Our Lady.
The vigil.
He died on the Vigil of Divine Mercy. That doesn't happen all that often, those two things coming together. And now we have Divine Mercy Sunday falling in what Benedict has highlighted in his homily was in the first day of the month of May. That is the Marian month. So it was providential. These things don't happen every year. They happened for his death in 2005. It happened again in 2011. And Benedict said in his homily, addressing a different question about why so soon, he said, this was pleasing to the Lord. And the Lord designs all things, and the confluence of the dates was pleasing to the Lord.
Yeah, I like how he swatted away a lot of the criticism. We've been hearing this prattling in the press all over the world. It was too soon, it was rushed, it was too quick. Benedict sort of took care of that in one fell swoop with the opening of that homily. And we will, of course, share clips of that beatification ceremony with you and the entire homily coming up. But we're going to take a break. More of our world-over highlights of the beatification of Pope John Paul II is straight ahead on the other side of this break. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to the World Over Live. I'm Raymond Arroyo in Vatican City. We recently spoke to Father Peter Gumpel. He's an official at the Cause of Saints to explain not only the intricate process of making a saint, but also to discuss some of the controversy surrounding John Paul's beatification. Take a look. I want to start with the process of beatification. I know that the investigations that are done are usually quite thorough. In the case of John Paul II, there was such a small window of 5 years. Did the rigor of that investigation suffer because of the short time frame?
Well, to tell you the truth, I was rather surprised that in this very short period of 5 years, I've seen hundreds of processes during more than 50 years in various functions, also high function in the Vatican itself for these causes. I've never seen anything like it. And my first impression, to tell you the truth, was how can they do it? However, there are a number of reasons which can explain how this had happened. And it is very useful to explain that to you. You know very well the Pope was not yet buried. When in St. Peter's Square, you get a huge manifestations with all these pandux, etc., and choir shouting Santo Subito. Now, the cardinals did not like this at all, because this is strictly forbidden. It was not spontaneous, it was organized, and that shouldn't have happened. Nevertheless, His Holiness decided to dispense from the law that within the first 5 years nothing could be done for a cause. Now, the Pope, this is a positive law. It's not in Holy Scripture or anything like. It's not a divine law, it is a positive law. And the Pope can indeed dispense from that, and he did. That is point number one. This saved 5 years, at least 5 years. Now, the second question you have to understand why this could be done so quickly is the following. The congregation the theologians of the congregation can handle 25 causes a year, not more than that. So if, for example, the causes are presented and there is a strict chronological order, the causes are discussed according to the time in which they have presented. However, even with having said that, in the case of a pope, and a pope who has reigned for 26, nearly 27 years, in which he had to take numerous decisions, and you know, people may agree or may not agree. And therefore, when I was investigating judge, for example, for the cause of Pius XII or Cardinal Newman, we have examined every single aspect of the life, and this takes time. I had no hurry. I said, we do not want to push this through. Let's decant the thing and see what comes out of the research, a painstaking research. Now, in the case of the present decision to proclaim the beatification of John Paul II in so short a time, there is one element which is of paramount importance. In all my experience, I have handled hundreds of causes. Never has there been one single cause in which the Pope in question personally knew the candidate or had a personal, deep knowledge of the man.
Well, there was Mother Teresa. John Paul II waited
yes,
5 years for her.
Yes, there was one, but she had to wait 1 year anyhow. And he knew her personally, but not in the same way as our present Holy Father knew Cardinal Ratzinger. You see, they knew one another 20 years. And in these 20 years, whenever the Pope was at home, not in his journeys, the Cardinal Ratzinger was received at least once a week. Now, and this for 20 years. So the Pope comes to know the candidate thoroughly, because these were not just courtesy visits, there were visits in which all questions of the government of the Church were discussed. Of course, the first collaborator of the Pope is the Cardinal Secretary of State, but Cardinal Ratzinger was called in at least once a week, sometimes more. They had dinner together, or lunch, or whatever, and they discussed all kinds of questions of faith, questions of moral, questions of appointments, questions of all kinds of political issues to be taken or not to be taken, and therefore our present Holy Father came to know his predecessor in a way which in no other case that I have handled was even possible. And therefore, here you have to take into account the only and final judge in the matter is the Pope. Strict to make this perfectly clear, if the Pope would have decided the day after the death of John Paul II to beatify him, he had the right to do this. And therefore, if after so long a personal contact with his predecessor, he has come to the absolute conviction this man was a man of faith, of hope, of charity towards God and towards man, and he was prudent and he was strong. He did what he could do. I think that entitles him to proceed even after so short to do this. And of course, investigations were done. I haven't seen the volumes of the Positio, that is none of my business. We have a law between the investigating judges not to interfere with one another, and I have never taken an initiative to investigate anything about the volumes prepared for the cause of John Paul II. But I know I knew him personally. He invited me several times to dinner. We discussed matters. My personal impression is excellent. But knowing that the Pope knew him so well, I'm fully convinced that he did the right thing.
We had occasion to speak with Carl Anderson. He's the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus. And not only was he near the Holy Father many times here in Rome, but he also accompanied the Pope during his international travels. Hear his thoughts and reflections on Pope John Paul II. Carl, you and the Knights traveled and accompanied the Holy Father on so many of these apostolic voyages. What does this beatification mean to you personally and to the Knights in general?
Well, it's an opportunity. It brings back so many memories of being with the Holy Father, of seeing him, the way he touched people's lives. You know, When we meet great people, sometimes we come away with the meeting being about them.
Right.
With John Paul II, the meeting was always about you, who he was meeting. And one of the things that stays with me the longest, I think, was something he did every week. He began that tradition of bringing in handicapped and sick people at his masses, at his Wednesday audiences. And then afterwards, he would take a few minutes and greet each of them, bless each of them. And he did that year in and year out, week in and week out. And I remember at World Youth Day in Toronto, when he arrived and the youth were greeting him, and they brought a handicapped person in a wheelchair who could not speak. And the Pope at that time, with the Parkinson's, could not speak that day. And the two were looking at each other and communicating without being able to talk to each other. It was one of the most moving things I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And it's things like that. We talk about the Christian personalism of John Paul II. It wasn't an abstract philosophy for him. It was a concrete existence, relationship every day with people.
In his long tenure as Pope, how did he influence or redirect, if you will, reshape the work of the Knights of Columbus around the world?
Well, wonderful question. I think maybe one of the saddest things about John Paul the Great would be to be a bystander. You're with one of the most great popes in history for so many years, and you stand on the sidelines and not participate. And I think one of the great things about the Knights of Columbus, we really tried to work with him. What were his ideas? What were his pastoral initiatives? What was his vision for the church? And okay, within our councils, within our mission, within our tradition, incorporate his vision. And we did that in many, many ways, and continue to do that.
The new evangelization is something you have written a great deal about, and certainly was a hallmark of John Paul's pontificate. How has that message gone on, and what form do you see it taking in this new millennium that he helped usher in?
Well, new evangelization at the center of John Paul II's thinking. Bring World Youth Day, how to bring the reality of Christianity to the next generation, the future, with hope. I think one of the greatest legacies is Pope Benedict XVI, a co-worker with John Paul II, and now carrying on the work of the new evangelization beautifully with his encyclical Deus Caritas Est. And so many of the John Paul II generation who have become priests, religious sisters, carrying on this work, the laity in their marriages and families.
What do you think will be the lasting effect of this beatification? You know, there's so many events around the world. We just had the royal wedding. You know, this one gets married, or that one, you know, as a baptism. And the media's glare starts turning on these events. What do you think will last from this event?
I think the most important thing of the beatification, we have one of the great popes in history, but now he's more than a great pope in history. He's a great saint for every member of the church. Every Catholic now can turn to him as a spiritual father.
Tell me, before I let you go, the Knights have been so committed to the pro-life work around the globe in advocating not only on behalf of the unborn, but frail elderly, the handicapped. Tell me, if you will, how his witness, particularly in the latter years, may have influenced the vigor that the Knights now have in that arena.
Well, Evangelium Vitae, his great encyclical, The Gospel of Life, where he talks about it not just as an ethic, not just as a philosophy, but as the presentation of Jesus Christ and his love for every human person. And this is the challenge that every Christian has, to express and witness to that love, to that redeeming love of the Savior for every human being that gives him dignity, that gives him a mission, that gives him a person, that makes him wanted. And this really, I think, his vision, his mission really invigorated Knights of Columbus, and especially in the later years of his life where he's suffering. And you see the dignity that he has doesn't depend on whether he's vigorous or hiking in the mountains or skiing or being able to make these journeys that he did so many times, but in the spiritual greatness that he had.
And continuing that mission. Carl Anderson, thank you for continuing yours.
Thank you.
I'm joined, as I was all weekend, by Father Raymond de Souza. Father, tell me how John Paul II influenced your vocation and the influence he might have had on your priesthood.
Well, I studied economics when I was in university, and it was in 1991-92 that I read Centesimus Annus, which was his document on economics and politics and culture. And that opened my vision to something beyond economics, to the human person, to the theology, to the dignity of the human person. And it was a step, one step after another, but that was an important step for me. And that's why I was excited, because he was beatified on the 1st of May, which is the 20th anniversary of Centesimus Annus. So that was an important part of my vocation.
Now, you also studied here in Rome,
I did.
I'm sure you saw him many times in the square.
Yeah.
What was that like? What of that experience did you take into your own priesthood?
Well, I was here from 98 to 2003, so that was towards the end. And, you know, his courage, his heroism coming week after week, especially during the Jubilee. The highlight for me was I was here for all 4 of those holy doors being opened, and I accompanied the Pope as a journalist at that time. And so those are, you know, unforgettable moments of those years here.
Well, thank you for being with us all week long. We're going to take a very quick break. When the World Over Live continues, we'll bring you some highlights of the beatification ceremony here in the Vatican. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to our World Over special, our synopsis of the ceremonies and events surrounding the beatification of Pope John Paul II. I'm joined on set by Joan Lewis, our intrepid Rome bureau chief, as well as blogger extraordinaire. Joan, great to be with you this whole week. Tell me for a moment what this means to you personally, watching this man that you traveled so frequently with on these 104 voyages. I know you weren't on all of them, but I'll bet it felt like you were on all of them. And you were certainly, he was outside your doorstep making history every day.
Well, you know, it's a good thing you didn't ask me to comment when they proclaimed him a blessed. I could not have spoken through my tears. Someone that I'd met so many times, been with, assisted at events, been so close to. And, you know, just the feeling you can say, I talked to a blessed. I talked to a future saint. He was so wonderful. He was so one of us. He never made you feel out of place in his presence. He always made you feel welcome.
He was very warm and direct, and you know, I always comment on the intensity. He had this intensity, and it was as if in a crowd he would seek people out and sort of hone in on people. It was amazing, his ability to make that personal connection even with a big crowd. You know, I often told the story when he passed away. Rebecca and I went to see him, and after the Mass, he came down the line and he kept looking up at Rebecca, and she had just converted to the faith a few months prior. And she didn't know what to do. She was paralyzed under the veil and the whole thing. And he walked over and he said, "Your name?" And she said, "Oh, Rebecca, Rebecca." Rebecca, like Old Testament, Rebecca, and over he would say that. And over the years when I would visit, and it's very curious, he would never remember me, but he always remembered Old Testament Rebecca. How is Old Testament Rebecca?
As it
exactly.
should be, yes.
As I certainly remember her. But it's and know her every day. But it was an amazing, you know, to know someone like that and to see him up close so often, and to have the privilege of narrating these events and watching him as he went to the major countries, the Middle East and the Jubilee events.
He was so human, and yet he was bigger than life. You always felt that in his presence. But one thing I always felt, and was if he would go from person to person, meeting a delegation, or you've been to Mass in his chapel, he talks to you and then he talks to the next person. I felt when he moved from one person to another, he was praying.
Yeah, he really was.
Prayer was an absolute integral part of his life, as the blood flowing through his veins.
And you know, you remember when you were in the chapel with him during the private Mass, they would bring you in and he would already be on the pray-dieu there praying.
He'd been there an hour.
And you'd hear this, almost a grunting. And many of those intimate, closer to him than we were, said this was almost a charismatic prayer. It was his way of, he was clearly in communication with God in an intense way.
I've had people say to me who had been to the Mass and to other things, when they would hear that, they said it was as if we interrupted a conversation he was having with God or his mother.
Yeah, exactly.
And you did feel that way.
You felt you were on Mount Sinai.
And he will have been in prayer for an hour before you even got in the chapel
really something.
for Mass.
We are about to go to our highlights of the beatification ceremony, that moment when the banner was unfurled and we saw John Paul II, blessed John Paul II, unveiled to the world. This crowd of more than 2 million people just went totally wild.
Well, and they must have applauded. I didn't count, but it had to be 10 minutes, 10 straight minutes. And then something would be said and the applause would get even louder. You could feel it ripple down Via della Conciliazione.
Here's a bit of the Holy Father's homily and clips of that moment of beatification.
Auctoritate nostra apostolica, facultatem
Pope Benedict is now reading the official declaration of beatification.
Beati nominen postrum appellitur.
And he's declaring that after consultation with bishops around the world and by his own apostolic authority, he's declaring John Paul to be blessed and declaring his feast day to be the 22nd of October.
Et Spiritus Sancti.
And there you have it, a new blessed for the Church.
And the picture is being unveiled in St. Peter's Square. And there he is.
Blessed John Paul II.
Blessed John Paul II. And there are his remains inside St. Peter's Basilica, near the tomb of St. Peter. And that familiar book of the Gospels once again opened on his casket. Those of us who were here during the funeral remember that moment of grace and beauty when the book of the Gospels began to flip. It flipped open during the Mass, and at the conclusion of the Mass, it flipped closed.
The choir is now singing the words that John Paul said on the 22nd of October, his new feast day. Open wide the doors to Christ, and you see this immense crowd who have come for this moment, and many tears are being shed in the piazza at the moment. Cardinal Vellini, when he read that short biography of John Paul, mentioned that he was beloved by all and feared as an adversary by those who knew that he represented a different source of power.
I love that shot of him, that picture that they have hanging now outside the balcony. It conveys not only strength, but that that impish look that he always had in his eye, that wise kind of sweet expression.
Look at that beautiful sight of all the
that he had for mankind.
There he is, John Paul II, on his way to being raised to the altars. Blessed John Paul II.
On non-stop for what? 5-10 minutes.
And the applause is going on and on.
And in a certain sense, you can say with, I feel some emotion at the moment, that this is like the end of the funeral mass. So it's almost like 6 years this
has
applause
been
has gone. And well, a continuation of that final farewell at the end of the funeral mass when the casket was taken inside to not far from where it is now. And now John Paul's back in the square that
and you hear that roar of the crowd all the way down to the Tiber here.
La
6 years ago, we gathered in this square to celebrate the funeral of Pope John Paul II. Our grief at his loss was deep, but even greater was our sense of an immense grace which embraced Rome and the whole world, a grace which was in some way the fruit of my beloved predecessor's entire life, and especially of his witness in suffering. Even then we perceived the fragrance of his sanctity, and in any number of ways God's people showed their veneration for him. For this reason, with all due respect for the Church's canonical norms, I wanted his cause of beatification to move forward with reasonable haste. And now the longed-for day has come. It came quickly, because this is what was pleasing to the Lord. John Paul II is blessed.
A questo momento anche la memoria di San Giuseppe Lavoratore.
Today is the second Sunday of Easter, which Blessed John Paul II entitled Divine Mercy Sunday. The date was chosen for today's celebration because in God's providence, my predecessor died on the vigil of this feast. Today is also the first day of May, Mary's month, and the liturgical memorial of St. Joseph the Worker. All these elements serve to enrich our prayer. They help us in our pilgrimage through time and space. But in heaven, a very different celebration is taking place among the angels and saints. Even so, God is but one, and one too is Christ the Lord, who like a bridge joins earth to heaven. At this moment, we feel closer than ever, sharing, as it were, in the liturgy of heaven.
Chiamato a confermare I fratelli nella fede.
Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. In today's Gospel, Jesus proclaims this beatitude, the beatitude of faith. For us it is particularly striking because we are gathered to celebrate a beatification, but even more so because today the one proclaimed blessed is a pope, a successor of Peter, one who was called to confirm his brethren in the faith.
La roccia su cui Gesù può edificare la sua Chiesa.
John Paul II is blessed because of his faith, a strong, generous, and apostolic faith. We think at once of another beatitude. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And what did our Heavenly Father reveal to Simon? That Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Because of this faith, Simon becomes Peter, the rock on which Jesus can build his church. The eternal beatitude of John Paul II, which today the Church rejoices to proclaim, is wholly contained in these sayings of Jesus. Blessed are you, Simon, and blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. It is the beatitude of faith which John Paul II received as a gift from God the Father for the building up of Christ's church. Our thoughts turn to yet another beatitude, one which appears in the Gospel before all others. It's the beatitude of the Virgin Mary, the mother of the Redeemer. Mary, who had just conceived Jesus, was told by St. Elizabeth, "Blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." The beatitude of faith has its model in Mary, and all of us rejoice that the beatification of John Paul II takes place on this first day of the month of May, beneath the maternal gaze of the one who by her faith sustained the faith of the apostles and constantly sustains the faith of their successors, especially those called to occupy the chair of Peter. Mary does not appear in the accounts of Christ's resurrection, yet hers is, as it were, a continual hidden presence. She is the mother to whom Jesus entrusted each of his disciples and the entire community. In particular, we can see how St. John and St. Luke record the powerful maternal presence of Mary in the passages preceding those read in today's Gospel and first reading. In the account of Jesus' death, Mary appears at the foot of the cross, and at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, she's seen in the midst of the disciples gathered in prayer in the upper room. Today's second reading also speaks to us of faith. St. Peter himself, filled with spiritual enthusiasm, points out to the newly baptized the reason for their hope and their joy. I like to think how in this passage, at the beginning of his first letter, Peter doesn't use language of exhortation. Instead, he states a fact. He writes, "You rejoice," and he adds, "You love him, and even though you don't see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy, for you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls." All these verbs are in the indicative because a new reality has come about in Christ's resurrection, a reality to which faith opens the door. "This is the Lord's doing," says the psalm, "and it is marvelous in our eyes," the eyes of faith.
La Costituzione conciliare Lumen Gentium
Dear brothers and sisters, today our eyes behold in the full spiritual light of the risen Christ, the beloved and revered figure of John Paul II. Today his name is added to the host of those whom he proclaimed saints and blesseds during the almost 27 years of his pontificate, thereby forcefully emphasizing the universal vocation to the heights of the Christian life, to holiness, taught by the Conciliar Constitution on the Church Lumen Gentium. All of us, as members of the people of God, bishops, priests, deacons, laity, men and women religious, are making our pilgrim way to the heavenly homeland, where the Virgin Mary has preceded us, associated as she was in a unique and perfect way to the mystery of Christ and the Church. Karol Wojtyła took part in the Second Vatican Council, first as an auxiliary bishop and then as Archbishop of Krakow. He was fully aware that the Council's decision to devote the last chapter of its constitution on the Church to Mary meant that the Mother of the Redeemer is held up as an image and model of holiness for every Christian and for the entire Church. This was the theological vision which Blessed John Paul II discovered as a young man and subsequently maintained and deepened throughout his life, a vision which is expressed in the scriptural image of the crucified Christ with Mary, his mother, at his side. This icon from the Gospel of John was taken up in the episcopal and later the papal coat of arms of Karol Wojtyła, a golden cross with the letter M on the lower right and the motto Totus Tuus, drawn from the well-known words of Saint Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort, in which Karol Wojtyła found a guiding light for his life. These words, totus tuus ego sum et omnia mea tua sunt, accipio te in mea omnia, prebe mihi cor tuum Maria. I belong entirely to you, and all that I have is yours. I take you for my all, O Mary. Give me your heart. In his testament, the new blessed wrote, when on October 16, 1978, the conclave of cardinals chose John Paul II, the primate of Poland, Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski said to me, the task of the new pope will be to lead the church into the third millennium. And the pope added, I would like once again to express my gratitude to the Holy Spirit for the great gift of the Second Vatican Council, to which, together with the whole Church, and especially with the whole episcopate, I feel indebted. I'm convinced that it will long be granted to the new generations to draw from the treasures that this Council of the 20th century has lavished upon us. As a bishop who took part in the Council from the first to the last day, I desire to entrust this great patrimony to all who are and who will be called in the future to put it into practice. For my part, I thank the Eternal Shepherd who has enabled me to serve this very great cause in the course of all the years of my pontificate.
Aprite, anzi spalancate le porte a Cristo.
And what is this cause? It is the same one that John Paul II presented during his first solemn Mass in St. Peter's Square in the unforgettable words, do not be afraid, open wide the doors to Christ. What the newly elected Pope asked of everyone, he was himself the first to do. Society, culture, political and economic systems, he opened up to Christ, turning back with the strength of a titan, the strength which came to him from God, a tide which appeared irreversible. By his witness of faith, love and apostolic courage, accompanied by great human charisma, this exemplary Son of Poland helped believers throughout the world not to be afraid, to be called Christian, to belong to the Church, to speak of the Gospel. In a word, he helped us not to fear the truth, because truth is the guarantee of liberty. To put it even more succinctly, he gave us the strength to believe in Christ, because Christ is Redemptor Hominis, the Redeemer of man. This was the theme of his first encyclical. This was the thread that runs through all the others. When Karol Wojtyła ascended to the throne of Peter, he brought with him a deep understanding of the difference between Marxism and Christianity, based on their respective visions of man. This was his message. Man is the way of the church, and Christ is the way of man. With this message, which is the great legacy of the Second Vatican Council and of its helmsman, the servant of God, Pope Paul VI, John Paul II led the people of God across the threshold of the third millennium, which, thanks to Christ, he was able to call the threshold of hope. Throughout the long journey of preparation for the great Jubilee, he directed Christianity once again to the future of God, which transcends history, while nonetheless directly affecting it. He rightly reclaimed for Christianity that impulse of hope which had in some sense faltered before Marxism and the ideology of progress. He restored to Christianity its true face as a religion of hope, to be lived in history in an Advent spirit, in a personal and communitarian existence directed to Christ, the fullness of humanity, and the fullness and fulfillment of all our longings for justice and peace. Finally, on a more personal note, I would like to thank God for the gift of having worked for so many years with Blessed Pope John Paul II. I had known him earlier and had esteemed him, but for 23 years, beginning in 1982, after he called me to Rome to be prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, I was at his side and came to revere him all the more. My own service was sustained by his spiritual depth and by the richness of his insights. His example of prayer continually impressed and edified me. He remained deeply united to God, even amid the many demands of his ministry. Then, too, there was his witness in suffering. The Lord gradually stripped him of everything, yet he remained ever a rock, as Christ desired.
E a dare al mondo un messaggio ancora più eloquente. Tante volte ci hai benedetto in questa piazza dal palazzo. Oggi ti preghiamo, Santo Padre, ci benedica. Amen.
It was a truly beautiful day and a magical event, in addition to being spiritually uplifting in so many ways. Now, Joan, there is a relationship and a little something you would do for John Paul II that you've rarely revealed in broadcast. What was it?
First time in broadcast today is the fact that for many years I would bake chocolate chip cookies for John Paul. I would bring them to the papal household, give them to Monsignor Stanislaw, and he would either call me or send me a note telling me how much the Holy Father enjoyed him. I learned the Holy Father loved chocolate. So I first brought over brownies and chocolate chip, and it was the second time and the fifth and so forth and so on. And whenever I see Cardinal Żywicz here or in Krakow, he gets chocolate chip cookies.
See that food feeding the saints. Joan Lewis, thanks for
Body
being with
and
us.
soul.
We'll check in with Joan's Rome on our website. And you know, this week has been for me so emotional in so many ways, largely because I miss so dearly my friend Father Richard John Newhouse, who joined me for all those historic events, the passing of John Paul and the election of Benedict. And I want to share with you just a moment of his comments about now blessed John Paul the Great. Take a look.
For many people, it's hard to understand the generation that was shaped and misshaped, perhaps in many ways, by the uncertainties and sometimes reckless novelties in the Church following the Second Vatican Council. And they look back to the 1960s and the early 70s, and they kind of shake their head and say, you know, what was that all about? Because what they have experienced is the everyday reality of the Church, so much influenced by John Paul II, has been this bold and confident proclamation, evangelization, this proposal to the world of a more excellent way. And it's now they will learn, you will learn, your generation, you're of that generation in many ways, Raymond, that what of course intellectually you always knew, and that is that this was an extraordinary moment. This is not the norm. And that we have to brace ourselves for the fact that we may never live, you may never live, to see a Pope who will so powerfully galvanize world attention on the gospel of Jesus Christ in the way that John Paul II did.
Father Richard John Newhouse, God rest his soul. Over my shoulder here you can see John Paul II there, the banner in St. Peter's Square that was greeted by such rapturous applause the moment it was unveiled. Father De Sousa, any closing thoughts on this beautiful weekend of John Paul II?
Well, it was a days of great emotion, as you mentioned. It brought back so many memories. I echo your comments about Father Richard, who was also a very important friend and mentor in my life, and I know that he and the Father's house enjoyed this week very much. And you know, this figure of John Paul II, I work with university students. All of them are now 6 years removed from his death. They were in elementary school when he died. And yet his message resonates with them, the figure of his sanctity resonates with them, and the Church was given a great gift in the 20th century in the life of John Paul. He was a titan, as Benedict called him. And when he's beatified now, it means that gift is prolonged, extended, and it's a gift just like the saints of the 12th century are with us. Now this new blessed is with us for the rest of the 21st century and beyond. They're great days of grace. The days of 1978 when he was elected were days of great grace, and his death. And it really feels to me like after 6 years, John Paul is back in the piazza and in the life of the Church in a new way. Great days of grace here in Rome.
You certainly could feel his spirit on that day of beatification. It was, he was alive, and even during the vigil, when we saw him on the jumbotron behind us, you quickly looked to the stage to see if you could catch him there.
And the young people responded as if he was with
in
them.
the flesh.
And certainly a few days ago on Sunday, that was the feeling. Was that he was back after a short absence, and that gives us a sense, you know, everything he did in his life was to teach us about the Christian life, and the beatification experience is what awaits all of us, God willing, is that separated by death we will be reunited in the company of the saints and in the joy of the risen Christ.
It really does underscore and remind us of that thin veil that separates us from this communion of saints, that they are there, they're interceding for us, they're as alive as we are, whether we see them or
they're
not.
They're more alive than we are, more alive than we are.
Well, at this point, that's an easy thing to say. Father Raymond De Sousa, thank you for all getting up early and being with us throughout the coverage, and we thank you for being there. You can check us out on Facebook, on Twitter, you can go to EWTN.com, Jones Rome is there, as well as my blog, and at RaymondArroyo.com. That'll link you through to Facebook and Twitter and all those fun things. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. I'm Raymond Arroyo, signing off from Rome. Thanks for joining us. Good night.